Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at our lineup optimizer again, and we are going to be focusing on different ways to incorporate exposure and the different uses of syntax and how this optimizer tool is kind of set up, because it's not terribly intuitive to do some of these things, but nothing crazy. We're going to go over, we've already done our blanket exposure, and we're going to get into more player-by-player setup. We're going to look at a different exposure strategy to kind of mix things up a little bit. Yeah, so I think it'll be fun. Let's hop into it. So, first things first, we're going to run our import statements, pull in our player list, and get our optimizer ready to go. Quick review. I don't know why that's all the way down here. That's confusing. What we have covered before, and I'm not going to get into the exporting out to bulk upload format because that's not relevant for this. So what we've done before, we get n number of lineups. We have our max exposure that's going to be blanket across the board for all players, and we get them out. We can take a look at them. La-di-da, right? Nothing fancy. If you're seeing this and that doesn't look familiar to you, you need to go check out the other videos. I'll drop a link up top. Should be popping up with a little information thing. Go ahead, click on that, go watch them. Get up to speed pretty quick. It's not terribly complex, but you gotta know what to do. Moving on, there's a way we can remove a player from consideration within our optimizer format. And now I know, easiest way, what we've done before, what everyone does, it's simple. You come in here, you take the players you don't want, you just delete them out of your player list before you even get started. That way you'd have no chance they're going to get into a lineup if you don't want them to, and that's good. But consider the scenario, okay, put on your thinking caps, folks, where let's say you don't want to completely remove them from the pool, but rather than tinkering with exposure across the board, let's say you just want to run 10 lineups without this player in it, 10 lineups without that player. Like let's say, you want to fade Giannis tonight. Give me the best 50 lineups without Giannis, period. I don't care about anything else. I want to know what's out there if I don't have him on a lineup. But maybe you want lineups with him too, and you don't want to have to keep going in and out and have different player lists you're feeding in. So real quick, you can come in here, set up your optimizer. Let's say we want to get Luka. So this optimizer.getPlayerByName, that's how we're going to pull a player out of the player list and do something specific with him. In this case, we're removing him from the player pool. So we're going to assign Luka as this player we've pulled out with our optimizer. And we're going to remove player, optimizer.removePlayer, and then just drop that variable, whatever. You can do player 1, player 2, you can do best player, worst player, whatever you want to name your variable, up to you, don't care. I named it Luka because the player is Luka, and that's easy for me to remember. Optimizer, remove player Luka. And remember, this is the same player list up here, and we add Luka. If we didn't put an exposure on, Luka's in all 10 lineups because Luka's very good at basketball. So we removed him. Let's take a look at our lineups now. No Luka. Amazing. Simple as that. Now one thing, couple things really. If you're going to do this method and you want to pull players out and you want to put players back in, the add player to lineup is going to be the command you use to force a player into contention, force him onto your lineup. Think of it as making him a minimum 100% exposure. He's going on your lineups, okay? What you cannot do, I repeat, what you cannot do is once you've removed a player, think you can just come right back in and add them. That's not going to work, okay? It's going to let you run the command. There's nothing to break that, but when you actually try to get lineups, you're not going to get a single one because that player doesn't exist in your player list within this little bubble of your player list. So all you have to do is reinitialize your optimizer, add player to lineup, and now say I want the 10 best lineups that have Luka, right? So now we can see Luka's going to be on every single one. Might be PG2 if he's not PG1, but he's there, okay? Luka's on all the lineups. Cool. Now, that's not really a fair thing to do because Luka was already on all the lineups, but Still, if you don't believe me, we'll do it again. Who's not on all the lineups? Brandon Ingram, he's not on all these. Brandon Ingram, you, sir, are now Luka. We run it again. Now we're going to see that Brandon Ingram is on every lineup, okay? So that's just a quick, easy way. You can force it in, say, you know, and you can do it for multiple players. You can say, these are my 3 cores, right? I want these 3 guys on every lineup I get. You can do that for all 3 of them, then run your lineups, and every lineup's going to have those 3 guys. So, this is just the basic. You can build off of this. This is a good foundational strategy to have. And I guess we don't need to do this section because I kind of just did it, going over the remove players. So locking a player to all lineups is what we just did. This time I did Danny Green because he wasn't on very many. And same deal, you got Danny Green, right? Whoop-de-frickin-do, we already did it. So now we're going to channel our inner Doug DeMuro and look at the quirks and features of this optimizer, okay? Players with injury designations. Now this is where it gets interesting, okay? Let's take a look at our player list. Okay, so we're not going to want players that are out, right? But let's say Malcolm Brogdon, all right? Let's say we want to do Malcolm Brogdon. He's a game time decision. We like him. We think he's playing. We want to lock him in. He's at a cheap salary, whatever it is. You want to lock in Malcolm Brogdon. You lock in Brogdon. The Brog. Whoop. Let's go ahead and do Malcolm Brogdon. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing we just did. Brogdon, optimizer, get player, add player to lineup. So far, so good. What's this? Can't generate lineups. I'll give you a clue as to why. Because he has an injury designation. This optimizer, by default, ignores all players with injury designations. It does not factor them into your player pool, okay? Regardless of what the designation is. If there is a designation, they will not come through on any of your lineups, all right? And we can do the same thing. We can check it again with KD. You're going to see the same thing. Kevin Durant, can't do it, okay? So how do we do this? Well, we could come through here. We could delete all of the players that have an out designation, or we could leave them in and just let it ignore all of them. We could come in here and we could delete all of the designations off of players that we want to factor in. That's another thing we could do pretty easily. You could look at the game time decision guys and say, okay, I want all of them in. That way, when it feeds in your player list, it doesn't see an injury designation to pull them out. Alternatively, there is a parameter you can pass to your lineup optimizer with injured. If we pass that parameter with a yes as the parameter, we're going to get all of the injured players with an injured designation, out, doubtful, game time decision, doesn't matter what it is. They're all going to be considered now. So now we have Karis LeVert, Kevin Durant, all these players that weren't there before. And you'll notice they're all going to be coming through, especially the players that haven't played in a long time because their salaries are going to be the minimum. Someone like Durant, who's playing pretty regularly, just not tonight, his salary is obviously still going to be high. So you might not catch that. But that's dangerous. Be careful. All injured players will now be brought in to your optimizer, and that's dangerous. We don't want that either. So I recommend finding a happy medium, and it's whatever you prefer. If you prefer to come through and delete out the injured players you don't want before running it in, do that. If you prefer to come in and just delete the injury designations off the players you do want to consider, do that. Just make sure you save it before you pull it into your optimizer, okay? There are ways you can go through and write a little bit more complex code to loop through your player list after it comes in and pull out whatever players. That's fine. we're not going to go over that right now because it's just unnecessary. For as little time as it takes to come in here in Excel or whatever, thing you're using and look at these guys and say, okay, first off, anyone who's not playing, I don't want, all right? We're going to hide them, except you'd be deleting, not hiding. So now let's look at our game time decision, guys. Who out of here do I want to consider? I want to consider Alfred Payton, Chetty Osman, and Malcolm Brogdon. Save, come back in, go do our business, and now they're going to be viewed as acceptable players to have. Now, again, there's not a best way to do that. Whatever makes the most sense and is the easiest and most efficient for you is the best way for you to do it. Now, we have something else we can work with called exposure strategy. Now, this is going to be something that can make you think your optimizer is broken if you're not familiar with how it works, as we discovered in the Discord with my Patreon members. We were using this, and we were setting exposures very high, minimum exposures very high for some players, and there would still be like phantom lineups coming through without them. It just didn't make much sense, which, by the way, that injury issue also figured out in the Patreon with those guys. So if you want to be on that side of things and be looking at this and helping drive some material and figure things out and be on kind of my side of things rather than just the viewer, but be a part of it, hop in the Patreon. Discord's a lot of fun. Guys in there are great. But this exposure strategy. After each exposure strategy, let me show you what I mean. So first off, running our normal optimizer, we're going to set Luka's max exposure to 50% and everybody else to normal, just to kind of get a baseline here, right? This is going to be very similar to what we had at the very beginning, except Luka's only on half the lineups, not all the lineups. So what we can do to mix things up a little bit is assign an exposure strategy. And notice this is not a string. This is a variable after each exposure strategy. This is something you import, okay? From your PyDFS lineup optimizer, you import get optimizer site sport and after each exposure strategy. The first thing we need to discuss is just how exposure is calculated. I know it's simple. It's very common sense if you thought about it. If you've never thought about it before and it's just a term that you know is important, just think about it real quick. It's basically how many times that player will show up over the course of your entire lineup setup. So if you're running n equals 10 lineups and you have an exposure of 30%, that means that no player will be on more than 3 lineups, because 30% of 10 is 3. And for Luka, it'd be the same thing, but for 5. Okay? So what it'll do is it'll look at it, and you'll count down your lineups. You'll say, okay, I use Luka, I use Luka, I use Luka, I use Luka, I use Luka. Oh, that's 5. 50% of 10. That's all for Luka. No more Luka. Throw them in the trash, okay? Moving on. Can't use Luka anymore. Do the same thing for these guys. It will calculate the number of lineups they can be on before running your lineups. What the exposure strategy after each exposure does is it will calculate your exposure after each lineup by lineup. So what it'll do is it'll run lineup number 1. Okay, here we are. So far, we've used 0 players because we haven't run a lineup yet. So all of our players are at 0% exposure. Okay, so we can use anybody we want for lineup 1. So we used them all. Well, that's our best lineup we can get based off of these numbers, which again is just the average fantasy points per game. Not a good metric to use, but it's easy. So we did 1 lineup. What does that mean? We have 1 lineup, and all of these players are on 1 lineup. 1 divided by 1 is 1. That means every single player in that lineup is now at 100% exposure. Okay? Which means none of them can be used on the next lineup. So we come down, and surely enough, none of them are on this lineup. So now we have 2 lineups. Everybody on the first lineup is in 1 lineup out of 2. That's at 50%. Okay? So even Luka, who has a 50% exposure, he's reached his max. He can't go on another lineup or he'll be over the 50%. Everyone in the second lineup is on 1 of 2. That puts them at 50%. So I can't use anybody from either of these two lineups on my third lineup because none of them have the exposure space to be used up. They don't have anything left. They're already at their max exposure or past their max exposure. So we come down, and that's a whole nother lineup, a whole nother set of guys. So now let's think about it. Now we have 3 lineups. Luka's on 1 of 3. That puts him at 33% exposure. He has a max of 50. That means he can go on the next lineup. Okay? Because that would put him at 2 lineups out of 4. He could. He doesn't have to, but he could. Everybody else that's been used is now on 1 of 3. So that puts them at 33%. That means Luka is the only player that is eligible to be used a second time on the 4th lineup because everyone else is only at 30% max, and they're currently sitting at 33, so they got to drop down a little more before they're able to be used again. So we look at lineup 4. Sure enough, we have Luka, and then a whole bunch of people we haven't used yet. So now Luka is on 2 of 4 lineups. That's 50%, and that's his max. So he can't be used again. But everyone else is now on 1 of 4. And it doesn't matter which one they were on. Everybody else from this lineup besides Luka is at the same exposure as everyone from this first lineup. 1 lineup out of 4. That's 25%. And they can have 33. That means they can go on the next lineup. So if we look at lineup 5, now we start to see some repeats again, right? Not Luka, but all of these other guys have been on a lineup before pretty much. So that puts them all at 2 lineups out of 5 lineups, which is 40%, which means none of them on this lineup can be used again. But Luka is now on 2 out of 5 lineups, and that puts him at 40%, which means he can be used because his max is 50, okay? And it's just going to keep stepping like that. Now, what that will do in a specific scenario, such as this one, is help diversify your lineups. Because if we come back up here to the top, and let's take the exposure off. Let's leave it on. At everybody at 50%, these first 5 lineups are almost identical, right? Luka, Shake, Jerome, Hardaway, Ingram, Barrett, Claxton, Randall, Jokic, Doncic, Milton, Jerome, Beal, Ingram, Barrett, McGee, O'Neal, Jokic. Like those are 3, 4, 5 lineups that are very, very similar. And then suddenly, all those players are starting to get dropped off, and we come down here to 10, and that's a whole nother lineup of guys, except for JaVale McGee, but whatever. So it helps mix and match things, but only if you have different exposure levels within the same set of players. So having Luka at 50 and having the rest of the field at 30 is going to create that offset that's going to make Luka get matched up with different players as you go down however many lineups you're creating. What would make this even better as far as diversifying your lineups is using group exposure. You can define a group of players and give them an exposure, or you can have individual players one by one. You can define them like we just did, and making sure to have a different max exposure comparatively to these guys, or a min exposure for some players. So you're saying they have to be on at least so many lineups. Nothing that you have to do, of course, and if you don't want to do this, that's perfectly fine. If you have your core, 3-4 guys that you love and you want 50 lineups of those guys on it, you're not going to want to do this. You're just not. You want the 50 best lineups with those 4 guys. You're going to add all 4 of them to the lineup, by the way we just did up here. You're going to do optimizer.add player to lineup. You're going to do that for all 4 of those guys. Then you're going to run your lineups, and you're going to get the best however many lineups you want with those 4 guys on it. That's a different scenario, okay? That's if you're very confident with what you have and you want to make the most of it. If you feel pretty good about what you have, but you want to mix it up a little bit, then you're looking more at something like this. But that's all we're going to go over for today. Going forward, we do have group exposures. We're going to get to how to define groups, how to stack games. I'm not sure how much of that overlap is going to be in one video. Probably it will be condensed into one, because that's not a whole lot of stuff to go through. It's just really showing you how to do it. There's not going to be a lot of explanation going on. As far as like how it's done, it's going to be like, okay, if you want these players in a group, here's how you define a group. Or if you want to stack this game, this is what you type in to stack a game. Pretty simple stuff. So that's going to be where we go for that. As usual, huge thank you to all the folks over in the Patreon and hanging out in the Discord, helping me get things going. I always appreciate that. Very grateful to have both that assistance and kind of getting some extra eyes on things, because sometimes I can just get the blinders on, and it's hard to take a step back and see things from a different perspective, whether that's somebody who doesn't have as much coding experience or someone who comes from a stronger background on the gambling side of daily fantasy that I know very little about. Getting the different perspectives there really helps me a lot to figure out what type of content I need to be creating, right? So huge shout out and thank you to them. If you guys are interested, you can get in for as little as $5 a month, or as much as $100 a month, or if you want to do more, you let me know and we'll work it out. But that's all we've got today. So I will see you guys next time.